Okay, I think it's time to start. Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure for me to welcome you to this panel entitled Against Neoliberal Conceptions of Bodies. My name is Miriam Hitabi. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Ottawa, and I will be chairing this panel. So to begin, we will hear Hannah Voegele in her presentation entitled Colonial Intimacies, Constellation of Property and Kinship in German Colonial Afterlives. Hannah is a research student at the University of Brighton School of Humanities Center for Memory, Narrative, and Histories. She's interested in the way in which modern property relations violently shape lives and relationships, and how to move beyond that as a political project and not just an intellectual exercise. Then we will hear Gary Kinsman in his presentation entitled Beyond Apologies, Rights, and the Police Against the Neoliberal Queer in Pandemic Times. Gary is a longtime queer liberation and anti-capitalist activist who lives in solidarity with Indigenous struggles. He is the co-author of the Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation, the author of The Regulation of Desire, Homo, and Heterosexualities, and an editor of We Still Demand, Redefining Resistance in Sex and Gender Struggles. He's also the author of many articles on sexual and gender regulation and resistance. Finally, we'll hear the presentation titled Human Bioeconomy and the Queer Politics of Fugitive Livability by Liujia Tian. Ian is a Sinophone left and a queer anti-capitalist. He is a Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Toronto Women and Gender Studies Institute. Ian examines the role of everyday vernacular material and cultural practices in the making of capitalism and its antithesis, liberatory movements in the context of global relations. So after we hear our panelists, I will give them a chance to react to each other's presentation, and then I will turn to the public for your questions. Please feel free to comment and ask your questions during the presentation in the chat box below or in the Q&A, and I will get to them later. So without further ado, let's begin. I will now give the microphone to Hannah. Hannah, it's when you're ready.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Let's see if it works. I hope it works. Well, thank you, Miriam, and thank you to all the organizers. I unfortunately have missed quite a bit of the conference because I'm calling in from Germany, so it's quite a time difference, but I'm excited for this, so let's see. Okay, so since last year when I submitted this abstract, my project has somewhat developed or maybe changed. So I've also changed the title. I'm going to explain a little bit what happened. So I started thinking about this project about 2 years ago, mainly frustrated by liberal feminism and especially by dominant responses to sexualized or gendered violence. So I was currently organizing for a feminist strike on the 8th of March within a recently re-energized feminist movement in Germany that had seen the massive mobilizations of women and queer people in South America and Spain. We were especially inspired by the uncompromising anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism of these strikes, encompassing analyses of the different and broad connections between economic and state violence and gender violence. At the same time, I was working in a working group on property, reading Cheryl Harris, Brenna Banda, Margaret Davis, and others, and become more and more interested in the far reach of the modern proprietary system into all aspects of our lives. So from this, I wanted to dive deeper into the connections between modern liberal concepts of property and violence, especially gender violence. So this is where I started my research, with a critique of current approaches to violence, liberal theories of ownership, and possessive individualism. And the more I researched, the more I stumbled into historical analyses. So over the last few months, I've tried to find my way through the specificities of German colonialism, and hence the alternative title, and also somewhat changed content of the paper. So I hope you can bear with me. So while the feminist strike movement unfortunately lost its momentum in Germany and never developed quite the impact and power it did, for example, in Argentina, Chile, or Spain, critiques of Germany's colonial pasts and presence have become more prevalent in recent years. For example, due to organizing efforts of migrant groups like Migrantifa. So this year, on March 8, 2021, about 20,000 women, cis and trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming people and trans men marched the streets of central Berlin. The protest had been organized by the Alliance of International Feminists, an alliance of explicitly anti-racist and anti-colonial feminist groups and individuals. The route through the center of Berlin had been carefully chosen, picking symbols for continuous colonial violence of state and private actors. So without going into more detail for now, I want to point to the intimate connections brought out by this kind of organizing against gendered violence. The closeness between histories of racial capitalism and gendered violence is intimately felt by some, yet still positioned as separate at first for others. What do discussions about abuse, rape, or femicides today have to do with reinvigorated representations of Germany's colonial past? It is these relations of proximity between subjects and objects made to appear far apart, the concurrence of supposedly separate things and places I try to stress in this paper. So the protest did not only create intimacies of bodies assembled for a common purpose. Even though this distinctive collective affective experience, especially 1 year into a pandemic and its individualized management of control that only allows the intimacy of the private household, is also somewhat part of this project. This form of organizing also pierced the notion of separate, exclusive, and enclosed periods of time and space, thereby stressing intimate connections established between them. So in this presentation, I just focus on some fragments from the struggles over ownership in German colonial lives and afterlives, and how they are articulated in intimate relationships. So mainly around the intimacies of the household and the family. So the household and the family, more specifically the white family, became central to ensuring continuous and expansive colonial possession. At the same time, still today, the family and romantic, mostly heterosexual relationships represent the most dominant association with intimacy. This, of course, is a very specific notion of modern European liberal intimacy wedded to the private home, marriage, and property. So I want to question this dominant notion of intimacy and point to both its conditions of possibility and its constituting character. So David Eng, for example, describes as the racialization of intimacy, and I quote, the ways in which the boundaries around the private sphere to hide its racial underpinnings, how idealized notions of the families we brace under the carpet. So when we look at the processes and relations that build those walls, wove those carpets, and at the same time enabled a formation of subject and family that understood itself completely separate to these processes and the people forced to make them possible, we see both intimate relations and subject formation in a different light. As Lisa Loeb asserts, it is precisely the, quote, labor of enslaved and indentured domestic workers that furnish the material comforts of the bourgeois home. So colonial appropriation of wealth by the European bourgeoisie also went hand in hand with emerging notions of freedom and liberal modernity. So focusing in on the specific notion of intimacy established to reproduce and cement hegemonic relations of ownership shows how other intimate relations had to be controlled and or destroyed, somewhat similar to what Hortense Spillers called the kinlessness requirement of property. So marriage, inheritance, and guardianship laws were used to control access to land and resources in settler colonial contexts. These practices and laws were not only racial, but racializing, not only gendered, but gendering. So in other words, by way of constituting ownership relations, they also constituted race and gender relations. Brenna Banda, of course, makes this argument about the racializing properties of colonial property law forcefully in her book, Colonial Lives of Property, where she draws out how colonial appropriation of land has been dependent on the marking of certain ontological qualities of the human and vice versa. So following her, I also want to highlight this co-emergence of capitalist property relations and racial subjectivities under the framework of liberal modernity. I just have a somewhat different focus. So the specific focus on different forms of intimate relations in the context of German empire brings out some maybe different levels of analysis and struggle, or so I hope. So the next place we visit is German Samoa. So "We catch that damned fellow." Under the sound of cries like these, Karl Eduard Michaelis, self-professed German hygienist, was forced to flee Samoa in 1911. Samoan women rioted against his racial thinking and drove him out of the German colony. Even among German colonialists, his views were not well received. He had arrived only shortly before and, appalled by the, quote, racial corruption in the colony, quickly published a racist open letter against interracial relationships. Maintaining that he was, quote, above all white and only secondarily German, Michaelis praised the US as better fulfilling what he saw as the imperative of colonialism, i.e. the advancement of the white race by way of a strong racialized order. The same kind of racial order was neither the case nor the consensus at the time in Samoa. While less settlers lived on the island, it had more mixed marriages, interracial families, and mixed children than other German colonies. Many German settlers, in fact, had been afforded access to wealth and social mobility by these marriages. So in Samoa, the specific political economic model for the colony had not been determined, and different actors struggled over the establishment of a settler colony versus a plantation colony, simultaneously faced with anti-colonial resistance. So these struggles over different models of using colonial possessions and extracting colonial wealth meant that in 1911, Samoan society was still less strictly ordered around emerging categories of race. In contrast, in German Southwest Africa, Germany's first and foremost settler colony, interracial marriage bans had already been instituted shortly after the turn of the century and the genocidal wars against the Herero and Nama peoples. While at the beginning of colonization and settlement in German Southwest Africa, it was custom for German men to gain access to property and trading connections through intermarriage with relative elite local women, this changed with the further establishment of settler society against strong resistance. Amongst others, these marriage bans meant that property settlements were refused to colonize women previously married to white German settlers. So in the end, while legalized relationships and familial arrangements were purged, the importance of sexual access to colonized women did not disappear. And crucially, white women did not stay inactive in their support of and investment in the white collective. To avoid the, quote, spiritual and economic ruin of the settler, the Colonial Women's League, or Frauenbund der Deutschen Kolonialgesellschaft, established an institutionalized program that sent white women in so-called Mädchenfuhren, so girl shipments, to the colonies, to be wed, form white families, and secure the survival of white settler society and its possessions. So whilst the Women's League's leaders and members were part of the ruling class, so mostly wives of high-level officials and owners of colonial companies, the women shipped off came mainly from lower classes. So the program was shortly interfered with by World War I and Germany's formal loss of the colonies. But after the war, the Colonial Women's League continued and increased this export of white women to former colonies in Africa, continuing private colonialism where state colonialism failed. Meanwhile, even if this strict racial ordering came later to Samoa, by the time of the Michaelis case and the so-called Women's Revolution, as it was titled particularly in the national liberal sections of the press, heightened anxieties about the colonies, heightened about the colonies in Germany. Especially the women's uprising was presented as a threat to German imperial hegemony and presented as proof of the dangers of intermarriage. So debates around the German family and racialized citizenship had moved from the periphery to the metropole and gained considerable traction, like here discussions in the Reichstag. So Liberal Colonial Secretary and previous governor of Samoa, Wilhelm Solf, famously proclaimed, "We are Germans, we are white, and we want to stay white," in an attempt to induce the Reichstag, so the parliament, to confirm to extend the interracial marriage bans from colonial to German law. And while this never actually made it into national German law, guidelines on how to proceed with intermarriage were sent to Samoa in 1912. These guidelines and the way they were put in practice show the plasticity and performativity of racial citizenship in Germanness. So maybe I'll give you a second to have a look at them. It's quite, well, interesting, I guess. Because so officially, children from so-called intermarriages were, before 1912, were considered white, while after the state they were counted as natives. So these guidelines and the surrounding social and political struggles make clear the impact of legal decisions on racialization and relationship structures. But they are also about more than just an arbitrary change in status from one day to the other. In this specific case, flexibility remained around racial conceptualizations and possible kinship relations, especially surrounding the notion of deserving versus undeserving of white status. So specific productive and proper members of colonial society were enabled access to the status property of whiteness. This shows that to be white, one must also own one's whiteness. This means to be in control of and own one's body, desires, choices, and actions, and adhere to notions of propriety and productivity. Thus, racializing laws put in place to secure hegemony reveal both the plasticity of race and gender relations and the effort expended to stretch the limits to the benefits of those making them. And if we redirect our focus on these struggles over ownership of land, people, resources, and somewhat crucially, the future of all these possessions, it becomes clear how closely notions of race, gender, and sexuality are entangled in these struggles and co-constituted by them. So this can be juridical determinants such as the interracial marriage bans or social interventions such as by the Colonial Women's League. Both of them somewhat make gender and race relations and thereby racialize intimacies and kinship relations. There could be also other examples like socio-legal and political economic interventions around homosexuality trials or enforced gender division of labor, but I don't really have time to go into that now. But the point is to come back to the beginning of the presentation. I hope this historical view somewhat stresses, once again, why we cannot find the solution for problems such as gender violence within the current liberal proprietary order. So this very brief look into the historical genesis of property relations and intimate relations and the way they're racialized, gendered, and sexualized makes once again clear how common solutions to violence, such as individualized responsibility, the private family, the criminal justice system, and bordering practices are not only unhelpful, but reinforcing of the logics leading to violent relations in the first place. So maybe, I don't know, one of the clearest examples in Germany is of course the events surrounding New Year's Eve in Cologne 2015-16, where sexual assaults of what were identified as mainly brown men against white women was met with stricter laws against sexualized violence that included clauses enabling easier deportations, implying a somewhat imported problem of violence from former colonized peoples that does not exist in the white nation and the white family. So, I mean, I assume I preach to the choir here, but these stories also make clear the danger of white and liberal feminism and the necessity of organizing anti-proprietary and thereby anti-colonialist and anti-capitalist feminist struggles. Okay, thank you. I'll stop sharing. Did I already? Oh, good.
Thank you, Hannah. I will now give the microphone to Gary. Gary, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Good morning. I'd like to dedicate my talk today, first of all, to the Palestinian resistance, which I think inspires all of us in terms of struggles for liberation and social transformation. I'd also like to dedicate my talk to Philip Corrigan, who recently passed away. Philip Corrigan is the co-author of the great arch English State Formation as Cultural Revolution. When I was a student at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, I learned a great deal from Philip, so I want to dedicate this talk to him. I also want to thank Hannah and Ian for their work. I haven't yet heard Ian's presentation, but I'm sure there'll be some resonation of what they're talking about with what I'm also speaking about. So to begin with, I'm speaking to you this morning from the territories of the Atikamekw Anishinaabe Nation and other Anishinaabe people in settler speak, that is Sudbury, Ontario. For me, this is not simply a symbolic gesture, but a political commitment to unsettle Canada and to make apparent the colonial violence at its roots, including very centrally the attempts to destroy Indigenous gender and erotic practices in life. This is unfortunately not the way that Two-Spirit people get addressed by EGAL and other mainstream neoliberal inflected LGBT groups within the Canadian context. Instead, in their view, in their work, Two-Spirit people get violently abstracted away from the history and practices of racism, colonialism, and genocide. As Suzanne Lennon points out, this happens in EGAL's 2016 Just Society report. And here I have some comments that are somewhat similar to Hannah's about how what I originally proposed to this conference has actually been transformed by the major events that have taken place since I originally submitted my paper. So there's been the COVID crisis, the pandemic, and the global uprising against anti-Black racism, and the police, which in the Canadian context has also been very much against anti-Indigenous racism and the police. And in many ways, this global uprising is still ongoing. So I had to transform and rethink what I was proposing in this context. To be clear, this is not the same terrain of struggle as before. We need to actually prepare for and to resist returning to racist, capitalist, neoliberal normality after what we have learned from the pandemic and the various injustices that have been mobilized in its context and the uprisings against the police and carceral injustice. This now more than ever requires an abolitionist approach, and I want to underline that, and organizing for a radically different world. This requires us holding open the spaces and cracks created by the global uprising against the police for as long as we can, facilitating what could be described as utopian impulses and horizons. This means specifically opposing the project of a return to normality on the part of the neoliberal queer. In part, I am doing this based on the work that I've been engaged in for the third edition of the Regulation of Desire, which should be out next year. To begin with, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism, in my view, was a response to the composition and cycles of struggle of the long 1960s that began to put racist capitalist social relations in question. So I want to emphasize that neoliberalism is actually a response to people's global resistance against capitalist and racist social relations. In response, the neoliberal project was to try to tear apart working class and oppressed people's power through cuts to social programs and the social wage, through capitalist globalization, but also, and this aspect of neoliberalism is missed so often, through the expansion of disciplinary relations like the police, prisons, law and order, and the tightening up of borders. This is precisely the areas that abolitionist politics developed by Black feminists centrally addresses, and why this must be central to our visions and practices now. What is the neoliberal queer in this context? The first form of neoliberalism that queer and feminist movements confronted in the late 1970s was, of course, a moral conservative, social conservative form of neoliberalism. That's not the only form of neoliberalism, although it's still very much around and very much alive. I just have to cite the names Trump, Bolsonaro, and Modi to give you diverse but different forms of moral and social conservative forms of neoliberalism. But the resistance of queer movements, the feminist movement, anti-racist movements, and others created a space for another form of neoliberalism to emerge that accepted certain forms of equality and rights, limited rights for women and queer people. And it's this form of neoliberalism that the neoliberal queer is allied with. What is the neoliberal queer project? Well, it's basically to simply be accepted into this white middle class, into the kinds of race and class bodies that are predominant within this white middle class and within the positions that are basically currently defined within this white middle class. This also produces a neoliberal queer history, which of course neglects our resistance from below, which is what I want to try and emphasize in this talk. And instead, in this neoliberal view, any gains or rights are seen as simply gifts from above. Our struggles become reduced to a politics of rights, inclusion and diversity, even intersectionality becomes reduced to inclusion and diversity in official speak within the Canadian context. This is separated from social transformation and participation in anti-racist class struggles. I hope that I can resist and reject these approaches in this talk. Since the theme for this conference is building utopias, I tell the story of resistance to the neoliberal queer as much as I can through narratives of embodied resistance. There was not an inevitable long march to the neoliberal queer. There were many attempts to disrupt it, to try to do things otherwise, even if the activists at the time did not fully understand what they were up against. But I also want to emphasize something else, the incredible amount of state, professional, and official work that has had to be engaged in to try to cover up the cracks and fissures that our resistance has actually created and obstacles that have been created in the path of the emergence of the neoliberal queer. I'm just scratching the surface here. This will be a quick ride. There is a shift from an initial gay liberationist focus where our liberation was bound up with the liberation of all oppressed people to a much more limited notion of rights by the mid-1970s in Canadian lesbian and gay organizing. But I want to cite one particular example of disruption of this rights discourse. Early on at a 1976 Toronto conference, Gillian Chase, a lesbian feminist with the Other Woman feminist paper, challenged the limitations of the early human rights campaign for John Damian. John Damian, for those who don't know, was fired from the Ontario Racing Commission for being gay, and this was one of the early and major human rights campaigns, especially in Ontario. Gillian Chase pointed to problems with single issue organizing, with a legalistic focus, with campaigns centering on the respectability of one white gay man, and in the separation in this campaign of John Damian's struggle from broader questions of social transformation. In doing this, Gillian Chase was drawing on the then current lesbian feminist discussions of class and class privilege. But this allowed her, it provided a basis for her to actually critique this early rights organizing. This also began to highlight problems with a focus on formal rights and equality that does not deliver substantive or actual equality. And that this approach, this critique therefore highlights what ended up being all of those people who were excluded from what we can describe as the rights revolution. That is, especially those who experience oppression on the basis of race, class, ability, health, and much more. This rather narrow formal rights approach privileges some far more than others, and it privileges those who are especially white, middle-class, cisgendered, and able-bodied, and allows them to rise to the top of queer community formation. Later, the use of the Charter in the 1980s accepts the Canadian state social form. And here, I really hear the echoes of what I learned from Philip Corrigan. It really accepts the Canadian state social form as the framework, as the very framework for which our rights, through which our rights and liberation can be achieved. The acceptance of this state social form, of course, is based on colonialism and genocide. This establishes an almost common sense basis for settler colonial homonationalism within queer communities. The police have been a major force organizing repression against queer and trans people. And of course, this has always been combined with racist policing against Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And of course, including many of those who are queer and trans. The mass resistance in the streets to, for instance, the Trucks Rebellion in Montreal, the mass resistance in the streets to the Trucks raids in Montreal in 1977 and to the 1981 Toronto Bath raids and other similar raids across Canada pushed the police back from using the strategy outlined in the 1969 reform. It's important to remember that the Wolfenton-based strategy enacted in Canada in 1969 was not about decriminalizing or legalizing homosexuality. It was about shifting sexual policing onto public, private, and adult youth lines so that homosexual practices expressed in public were to be much more highly policed, and those involving people under the age of 21 were to be more highly policed. We actually see an escalation of sexual policing after the 69 criminal code reform. The police in these bar and bath raids were using the 1969 criminal code reform to go after homosexual sexual expression, homosexual bodies, engaged in pleasure in so-called public spaces. Our resistance curtailed their ability to engage in these mass raids against bars and baths, although our resistance did not prevent them from continuing to police individuals in terms of parks and washrooms. In response to this mass resistance, which did rupture the sexual policing regime, there was a lot of official and state work to try to manage, limit, and close down the ruptures that our mass resistance had created. For instance, in Toronto, the Brunner Commission into the Toronto bath raids' main recommendation was that there was a, quote, lack of communication between queers and cops, pushing the need for liaison or dialogue committees between the police and queer communities. The Right to Privacy Committee, the mass defense organization of those arrested in the Toronto bath raids, and the majority of the Toronto Gay Community Council were adamant in their opposition to any collaboration with the police. They pointed out that as the police were enforcing oppressive laws against people in our communities, this would involve queer people in policing other people within our communities. But unfortunately, some went on to do this collaboration anyway, rupturing relations and undermining the community council. As these mass mobilizations died down, a white professional middle-class gay strata rises to the top of our community formation. They become the spokespersons for the community. This also becomes tied up with practices of gentrification and emerging real estate class interests. There was the active involvement of some white middle-class gay men in campaigns against sex workers, shattering previous supportive relations. This occurs especially in Vancouver, and also against homeless or unhoused people in a number of centers across the Canadian state, including Toronto and Vancouver. In this context, the police become the allies and defenders of a layer of white middle-class gay men. A one-sided class struggle was initiated often under cover of a supposedly classless and raceless community politics that transforms community formation in the interests of this middle-class white strata, giving this community formation a distinctive race and class character. Very briefly on the AIDS crisis, and I wish I could go into more detail here, there is an important history of AIDS organizing and activism. When governments abandon people, we, and here I'm using we as the collective project of AIDS organizing and AIDS activism, we were the ones who provided support and mutual aid. We were the ones who developed a collective social responsibility for safe practices, including eroticizing safer sex. And it's important to point out that collective social responsibility was actually not in any way, shape, or form based on neoliberal individualism, which of course permeates what's going on in the context of the pandemic right now. We developed a critique of public health. We always ask questions about which public and whose health is being defended. As public health practices actually organized discrimination against many groups of people they designated as high-risk groups, including queers, but also including, quite centrally, Haitians, Africans, and other Black people, drug users, and often sex workers. And of course, these categories are not mutually exclusive. On the other hand, they defined the general public as being white, middle class, and heterosexual in character. And it's very important that we remember this history and remember this history in the context of the current pandemic. We organized inspiring direct action politics that won treatment access, extending people's lives. We developed critiques of pharmaceutical corporations and their profit rates. We developed critiques of drug trials. We developed campaigns for healthcare for all, and we called for a global transfer of resources to the global south if the epidemic was to be addressed. But this was also managed and tamed through state funding and regulation. Community-based groups were transformed into what were called AIDS service organizations with executive directors and boards of directors. Large sums of funding, and Ross Higgins has traced this in Montreal, transformed relationships within gay community formation because of this large infusion of funding from state agencies. But in the current pandemic, despite the major relevance of these organizing experiences, these activist acquisitions are forgotten. And there is a social organization to this forgetting. This is in part because these are too radical. These are too challenging to ruling public health practices and to the ruling of the pharmaceutical corporations. And they're too associated with direct action politics for neoliberal queer forces to put forward. Instead, we need the resistance of remembering. And here I would cite the AIDS Activist History Project as one source for this remembering. Okay, I'm going on a little bit longer. This is taking longer than I thought, but I will try and sum up in a couple of minutes. The same-sex marriage campaign was only about respectability, was not only about respectability, but also about the relatively de-eroticized neoliberal body, and not a focus on actual sex and sweaty wet bodies. But it was also very much a focus on racism and racial coding. EGAL in its organizing made use of a racial analogy, specifically regarding the anti-miscegenation laws. Omi Sheree Dryden notes that, and I quote, anti-miscegenation laws dictated that Black people were legally prohibited from marrying white people. Through this use of racial analogy, EGAL suggests that same-sex couples being prevented from marrying was just like the racism, discrimination, and violence people endured in the United States. Dryden goes on that this obscures histories and current forms of racism in Canada, and that the deployment of this analogy productively constructs sexuality and race as separately occurring conditions, with gay bodies then understood as white and Black bodies understood as heterosexual. To construct a lesbian and gay subject alongside a Black subject is to produce and declare a white gay subjectivity, end of quote. There's a long history in response to the racism that queer people and trans people who are racialized, who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color have encountered within broader social relations and within queer community formation. Rooted in this long history, Black Lives Matter in 2016 engaged in what I would describe as the beautification of the Toronto Pride Parade, which I hope people are familiar with. In response, there was a lot about gay white racism, attempts to define Black bodies as not being queer and trans bodies, but this disruption was a major challenge to neoliberal queer alliances with the police, and since then it's been able to be maintained. I just want to mention that in response to the purge campaigns against queer people from the public service and the military as national security risks from the 1950s to the 1990s, there was a shifting of demands for an apology from below to demands for an apology from above. I don't want to go into a critical analysis of this, but to point out that EGAL in this context, even though Justin Trudeau's apology statement was decades late, that they actually give him a leadership award after his apology statement. Despite the major limitations of this apology and what it leads to, and I can go into this in more detail in the discussion if people want, out of the funding that's provided for the class action settlement and to EGAL, there's actually been the creation of an infrastructure that actually can fund neoliberal queer projects and to maintain that type of hegemony. So in conclusion, what I'd like to point to is that we're actually in a new context. There are crucial dividing lines with the forces of the neoliberal queer now on the other side of the racialized class struggles that we are involved in. This means that we actually need to reject neoliberal queer claims for gay or queer unity, because it's unity on their terms and preventing us from actually joining in the collective project of the racialized class struggles that we need to engage in from our side of this struggle. This means we need to be on the side of Black Lives Matter, Indigenous struggles, and to adopt an abolitionist approach that moves us beyond rights, the police, and carceral injustice. This means that we're tied up with radical social transformations, with mutual aid and caring, and our own social reproduction, including the social reproduction of our movements and communities at the center. This is what can provide us with hope and the revolutionary love to sustain our struggles. The struggle continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. I will now pass the microphone to Ian. So Ian, as soon as you're ready, you can start.
Thank you so much. I find it difficult to follow Hannah and Gary, so I will do my best. So I'm speaking from the traditional land of Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississauga on the Credit. And I'm also going to say that settler colonialism is something that is quite central to my analysis as well. And I am going to share my screen. Let me see how I do that. Spare me with 1 minute. share screen. Yes. Can you see my screen? Okay. So the paper has changed also significantly since I first came up with these ideas, but I do wanted to start by talking a little bit. Also start my timer. About how I arrived at this particular topic. So in 2019, I was involved with stopping the deportation of Jubandik Singh in Canada. He was an international student from India. The reason why he was deported was because she was working, exceeding the time she can work on his study permit. And around the same time in 2019, I was also getting ready to welcome a queer refugee to settle in Toronto. So I was looking at two processes unfolding before my eyes. So on the one hand, there is this punitive state power that deports Jubandik Singh. On the other hand, there is this congratulative state power that welcomes queer refugees. People would say this is just another example of the fake acceptance of Canadian settler state. What I wanted to talk about in this paper is not to say that that is not true. What I want to do is actually to sit with these conflicting realities and to think about what it means for us to have a more material analysis of acceptance, of deportation, and of welcoming. So the central question, what is the price of sustaining in life, drives through this paper. For queer refugees, for example, or any refugees, the price is actually dependent on how much they're willing to earn. So in Canada, in Canada's settlement program, there is a resettlement system program that outlines an income threshold incentive policy that basically deduces governmental support for self-sufficient refugees. So in this policy, whenever a refugee earned up to 50% of the total monthly RMP income, the government will actually deduce their support on a dollar-to-dollar basis. And also bear to mind that the government only provides support for a year for refugees. So in fact, far from being humanitarian, the Canadian federal government actually regulates the amount of financial assistance refugees, but also queer refugees are entitled to, and pushing them to become more productive for Canada's settler economy. On the other hand, for minors like Alpha Anoa and Mojisola, according to the CBSA, the price is actually $320 per day. Both of them are minors still living in Toronto's immigration holding standards. So I wanted to use these two examples to ask three questions. First is about what do we learn when we're juxtaposing instances of deportation, detention, and humanitarian acceptance together? How are a rescuable and an expendable life co-produced? And how is this co-production tell us about life, value, and time in settler Canada? Of course, I'm not the first people to think about these complex issues. Derrida has wrote about this particular topic in 2000 in his essays on cosmopolitanism and forgiveness. Legal scholar Jacqueline Bakba also discussed how the asylum-seeking system actually plays an important role in making exclusionary migration policy laws defensible and justifiable. What I want to do is to provide a more material analysis to how this processes play out. So I'm using this concept that I borrowed from Robin Anderson, human bioeconomy, to describe a process on the one hand commodifies people's desire for life vitality into economic productivity, such as policies making queer refugees productive. On the other hand, this process extracts value from manufacturing the unproductive, motionless, and excessive bodies and times. These bodies and times are unsubsumed by the perpetual moving productive circle of capital. The example of such would be the detained migrant whose life and time might seem to be surplus to capitalist time. And I'm also drawing on an idea of vitality to talk about more expansively how life making is a collective and encompassing and holistic process. In this life vitality, we also need to distinguish between life vitality with reproducing and the life vitality with expanding. And that's something that I insist when we talk about life in general. So another key term that I'll be using is bioavailability. So I also borrowed this from an anthropologist of India, Lawrence Cohen. He was writing about organ transplantation, but I think there is also a possibility to talk about how life vitality can become available for value extraction. And I think my discussion with Nefeli Tadia on these points. So then I'm going to divide this paper into 4 parts. So the first part is some kind of basis of theoretical foundations. So of course, I'm still building on labor theory value, but my idea of a life vitality is to say that concepts such as labor power does not capture life-making activities that we all do. And that's very important. Also, I'm also contesting and supplementing neo-material theory of neo-Marxist theory of immaterial labor, saying that not all of our cognitive abilities are being valorized by capital. There are so much more that are unsubsumed and become a remainder of the process in capitalist accumulation. Of course, you can probably see Foucault's biopolitics and Mbambe's necropolitics in my framing, but also Black radical tradition and the indigenous critique of settler colonialism, specifically in Canada, that I'm building upon. Now I'm going to, in the interest of time, move into the next section, rescuable life. So in the context of humanitarian rescue, to refugee life is actually an economic operation. 2 frameworks, specifically in Canada, organize Canada's transnational moral politics. First is humanitarianism. As a concern for the suffering others and as an interventional project, it has been central in Canada's war overseas as well as settler states' domestic refugee policies. Canadian refugee settlement programs, however, have been taking an individualist and private approach. Private sponsors, as well as individuals or non-for-profit organizations, become sponsorship agreement holders and take full or partial responsibility for refugee resettlement. So in reality, the government does not actually invest anything in these refugee programs. A second, more specifically to queer refugees, is the framework of SOGI-based violence. SOGI as sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. The imagined or the real victim of SOGI-based violations produced the desire to save queers elsewhere, reinforcing both the binary of liberal and multicultural West versus the traditional backward West, but also to actually distance Canada from these global violence that actually produces homophobia and transphobia on a global scale. And I think Rahul Rao's recent book, Out of Time, touches precisely upon these important issues. So how is a refugee get saved in Canada? So a rescued life first had to reduce their life to eligible identities for scrutiny, speculation, and gazing. So Melissa White, for example, has looked at these archive of queer refugees applications, and her theorizing of technology of effect, that certain kind of trauma, injury are mobilized to fit a particular standardized narratives. And these narratives, again, actually produce economic values in terms of funding to NGOs, but also funding to CBSA as well. And second, a rescue life is also more than the claimants of human rights. It is important to think about this within the discourse of human security, and also to always remember queer migrants and refugees are not simply as sexed subjects, but also as racialized, classed, and gendered ones. The classed ones is very, very crucial because not everybody is familiar with language LGBTQ. And those who are familiar with these discourses are already in a more privileged position to use these discourses to either save themselves or to achieve their the liberty and freedom they desire. Third, once passed by the reviewing process, which would take actually more than 3 years for in some cases for a refugee claimant to whose whose application can be reviewed. The Canadian immigration legal system actually produced enormous legal barriers for their settlements. And I know Gary has written extensively about Bill C-31, and that I would not go into details. Once they are settled, their resettlement is first offloaded by the settler government to private sectors. And the social reproductive work, such as funding housing and integration, were again downloaded to volunteer settlement team members. So under the disguise of the volunteerism, what we are actually seeing is this downloading and the neoliberal privatization and individualization of care work and social reproductive work into people who want to help in one way or another. And last 2 points, the corporate system of NGOs are turning identity into zones of value extraction. So examples are unnamed NGOs in Canada, for example, are claiming how many people they have saved and using these as examples for more funding and from the government, but mostly also from private donors. So in a way, we could think about the freedom that queer refugee actually received as a transaction. It's a transactional relationship in which saved life is actually indebted to the Canadian humanitarian state. A queer refugee's life and time becomes something owned to the Canadian state, and to be rescued is to be bioavailable, so that one's experiences and temporality can be a form of debt to pay off to the benevolent state. So in this way, a rescuable life is not contradictory actually to the intensification of immigration control. Instead, it's actually more productive to frame rescuable life as conditional acceptance that is always haunted by the dog figure of the expendable life. So the extendable life is, in this context, it's a life reduced to physical existence measured through time. In Canada, thousands of people are detained in migrant holding centers, so provincial jails. There are several reasons why they are held, but the most common reason is that they're held because they're deemed unlikely to appear in court. That would be the immigration court. So basically, it's the criminalization of illegals and the securitization of the borders that produces particular kinds of racial violence against who would be deemed as unlikely to appear in court. And you would probably right to say that it's actually Black and people of color who are mostly deemed to be unlikely to appear in court. So these securitization produce particular kind of space and time, and I know it's 15 minutes, I'm gonna wrap up in 3 minutes. So the first is the space of expendable life. The Canadian state has been promoting a more humane way of incarceration. So for example, new facilities are incorporated with ethical concerns, and non-for-profits such as John Howard Society are building community case management, which is basically a parole system for migrants. In 2016, the Canadian government pledged millions of dollars to build 2 new humane holding centers, and one of them is in Laval, Quebec. I use this particular site to actually highlight how these space, to highlight how human bioeconomy actually operates to enclose space and capture bodies and extraction. As you can see, this proposed prison, it's actually very close to 3 other prisons in adjacent. So this whole place and this whole land is used as a particular space of a detention. Second, I wanted to also discuss the temporality of expendable life. I'm going to show you a design map. So as the design map demonstrates, detention centers are segregated spaces marked by particular temporal rhythm. Detained migrants first encounter a waiting area lined with surveillance cameras. The center will be divided into a staff area in the west and the detaining area in the east. And both areas have different temporal rhythm and different degrees of freedom. Temporality orders within this spatial and material formations in which waiting, either prolonged or unexpected, is part of embodied experiences. Restrictions for resources, space, activities, and information create a very destruction environment for detainees where time actually becomes motionless. So as you can see, the time of people who are detained, although there are only a small amount of them are detained over 99 days, but considering thousands, the amount of people who are actually detained at any given time, the number of people who are detained over 99 days is actually quite significant. Another layer of surplus time is that motionless time is not unproductive for capital. That to keep them alive is actually become another way to be productive. We can think about how a whole range of activities and economic operations, from catering a CBSA staff, from security, from transportation, design, building, construction of these centers, produce a particular way of economic operation. Rescued and expanded life actually exposed liberal humanism crisis in settler Canada. So on the one hand, wounded human bodies such as queer refugees facing life-threatening danger are saved partially for Canada's political branding. On the other hand, illegal human bodies, illegal, quotation marks, are preserved to be slowly expanded. In both cases, private companies, NGOs, and state institutions constitute an extensive extractive regime. I have demonstrated that in the case of queer refugees, the Canadian state institutions set up multiple economic, legal, and political barriers, while taking the credit for being the global moral leader. In the case of detention centers, state institutions' legal system produce illegal bodies, making possible an economy expanding life and surplus time. So in the paper, I also discussed community work with queer refugees and migrants. and I can get to that in the Q&A, and that's all. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ian. Before we turn to the questions from the audience members, I would like to give you, our panelists, a chance to react to your co-panelists' presentations. So before we do that, I would still like to invite the public to write their questions in the chat box below or in the Q&A box. So is there any reactions from our panelists? Or we can go straight. I know we have one question already. Maybe we could read that one and see where the conversation goes. So our first question is from Alexis. He says, it's for everyone. He says, I'd like to hear about the ways pro-women and pro-LGBT center-right discourses are used today to justify racist but also sexist policies intended to control racialized and women's bodies. We can think of France and Quebec, for instance, where we've seen policies put forward to prohibit Muslim women to wear the hijab and other veils. There's also this idea that imperialist wars abroad would be justified, between brackets, by the fact that we're fighting for the freedom of women and queer people in backward countries. Does it seem to you like a hegemonic reappropriation of feminist and queer discourses to reassert domination? What do we do to fight this kind of reappropriation and to reaffirm the solidarity of feminist/queer and anti-racist struggles, and to reaffirm their progressive dimension? I'll copy paste the question to the chat box so you can have a look at it.
I can address some of that, or at least start, and other people can chime in. I think the question is quite excellent in terms of pointing out what many people describe as sort of homo-nationalist responses that have become quite dangerous and quite damaging. I guess just one quick comment around homo-nationalism is that I think sometimes that term gets used in a way where it sort of seems to just float around, but it actually needs to always be grounded in social and class relations and struggles. So I think we actually need to talk about how feminist rights, women's rights, gay rights actually get deployed in this imperialist, colonialist context. I mean, including around Palestine, in terms of the Quiet Wars within Pride Toronto. So I think this is actually really important for us to, and this is another sort of line of demarcation, if you want, that we have to be very clear that any attempt to establish more rights, our liberation, is actually bound up with the liberation struggles of oppressed people around the world, and that we cannot allow ourselves to be complicit in these imperialist and colonialist projects. So maybe I'll just leave it there. I think it's a really important question and something we really have to be aware of. I also know that at various points, and this is, I think, particularly strong in some European contexts, and Hannah might want to refer to it, that some white gay men in particular have tried to identify Islam as the major threat facing queer people today. And this is a very, very dangerous approach. So maybe Hannah wants to take that up a little bit more, but thanks for the question.
I mean, I can go next. I'm not sure if I can really take up that question, but maybe, yeah, I also think it's a really important and well-phrased question. Maybe just one comment that maybe around the term of reappropriation, because maybe one thing that I try to do in my paper and just generally think is point to some continuities. So, I mean, I guess if we look at the history of white bourgeois women, for example, and feminist organizations in this context. So for example, the Colonial Women's League that I've been talking about was part of the women's, just general women's organization of Germany during that time. So there's a long history, I think, of propertied bourgeois ruling class women to follow and further imperialist, colonialist politics. So it's not necessarily a surprise that they continue to do that and continue to try to dominate the discussion through sometimes some insidious ways. And I mean, I think it's also, I mean, the question of anti-trans hate within feminist struggles. I mean, in the UK in particular, it's quite extreme. We can also see the kind of like overlap and concurrence with like right-wing conservative women's organizations, kind of like hiding under a progressive banner, if you will. But I mean, I think maybe that's it for my comment. Maybe just pointing out some continuities. I also found interesting, maybe for the context of the US, I think Stephanie Jones-Roger wrote a book about white women slave owners, and the way in which, you know, even if at some point under the system of couverture and others, women had less rights, there's a lot of ways, particularly for ruling class white women, to, you know, gain a lot of power and influence. Maybe I'll leave it at that without having answered Gary's question. But maybe Ian wants to say something first.
Yeah, I think both of you have provided great answers. I have nothing to add, but just to say that Raymond Williams said something always stuck to me. He said, hegemony is always a lived experience. It's nothing except analytically. So what it means is, when we think about how the hegemony appropriates, it's never an absolute complete process. If we live at how lived people negotiate that appropriation, and that's, it leaves more space for thinking about, for example, utopias, but also think about resistance of these reappropriations. Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. I would have a question for you all. In light of Ian's presentation on biopolitics and bioeconomy, I'm sorry if there's noise, there's work outside, but I think with the pandemic, we've seen very clearly whose life is expendable and whose life is to be protected and rescued and cared for, not only in the migration context, but also in the workers' context. So nurses and cleaning employees, precarious workers in warehouses and delivery people. So I would like maybe to hear our panelists about that, about how the pandemic has made these inequalities very clear, and how what are your thoughts and insight about this specific context?
I can say a few things and try to be really quick because I realize we don't have that much time.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes.
Okay. I think all pandemics, all epidemics are condensations of social relations, right? The AIDS crisis was one. This current pandemic is as well. And they all are, you know, as much about their social lives as they are about what some people might want to describe as science. And I actually think people need to be more critical of this approach that comes out of climate justice, and even in the context of the pandemic, just follow the science, because all science is socially constructed and can be quite a problem. I think what we've learned in the pandemic is absolutely crucial for us to hold on to and never to forget, which of course is who actually does the labor that sustains our lives, right? And it's of course, you know, gendered in character, and it's quite racialized in character. And this is absolutely fundamental for us to hold on to. But of course, who's actually benefiting from the reorganization of racist capitalism in the context of the pandemic is, you know, in some ways the 1%. I'm just using that to try to summarize it. Those are the people who are actually benefiting from this pandemic, and from the deaths of all sorts of people, like the conversion of long-term care facilities into death camps. in many parts of the Canadian state for a period of time, the ways in which marginalized and precarious workers have been made so vulnerable, and racialized people have been made so vulnerable to these things, that people in detention have been made so vulnerable, that migrant workers have been made so vulnerable. So we need to actually reverse that. We need to not return to normality. We need, because that's what normality is. If we return to it, we need to return to a very different vision of the world. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Hannah?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just picking one thing maybe because I've also focused on the family somewhat, and I feel like that focus is also quite strong in the pandemic. I mean, I'm speaking from Germany, but the way in which, the way the pandemic has been handled has both depended on and restricted people to nuclear family concepts of living, of caring for children, the elderly, ill people, and so on, has obviously like revealed a lot of things and exhausted a lot of people to an immense amount, and also shown the violence of the household and the nuclear family. I mean, we've seen all the statistics. I probably don't have to reiterate that, but maybe that's just one aspect of the pandemic that is also somewhat related to what I've been talking about historically.
Thank you, Hannah. Ian, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think both of you also had great answers. I think I would just say one thing. Apart from these social relations that are deeply, deeply unequal, that just display in front of our eyes, I also want to say the pandemic also revealed the fantasy of the liberal bourgeois personhood. The fantasy about how somebody is internally reflexive, self-contained, and just were able to live on their own. It's just a fantasy. And this fantasy has structures how we understand society, how we understand our relationships with others. And this is just at least to me, how that fantasy is broken. And the state is trying to piece it together as much as they can. And our job is to dismantle that fantasy, because it is just a fantasy after all. Yeah, I would just say that.
Thank you, Ian. So we're almost out of time now. And before we end, I want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for their very rich presentations and discussions and insights. I would also like to thank our audience member for their attention, questions, and of course, the team behind the Great Transition for organizing this event and this panel in particular. So are there any final words before we close this very interesting panel?
I just want to thank the organizers as well, and to thank Miriam for facilitating, and to just point out that these discussions must continue, that the struggle must continue, and we need to provide and find more forums and networks for these discussions to take place. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Also, thank you, Elise, for the technical support.
Thank you, Elise. Okay, so on that note, I will thank you again. I will thank everyone again and wish you a very nice end of the conference. And I hope to meet you again sometimes.